Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Cusack, Editor-in-Chief of The Hill. Thank you for joining us for our program today, The Future of Defense, the Next Frontier for Military Flight. We would like to thank GE Aerospace for their support of today's event. Air power is a core component of our national defense ecosystem. As the United States assesses various geopolitical tensions, how might a modern air power technology increase competitiveness and propel the U.S. Air Force into the future of defense? Is the United States making the right investments to ensure readiness? Is the defense industrial base adequately prepared to meet modern defense needs? And what could the future hold for military flight? We will be putting these questions and more to our exciting lineup of speakers. But before we get underway, just a reminder that you can tweet us at the Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillDefense. Here to set the stage for us as our first guest is a 25-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force who served in 3 combat operations. Please welcome John J.V. Venable, the Senior Research Fellow for Defense Policy at the Heritage Foundation. J.V., thanks for joining us.
Bob, it's great to be with you.
Well, as I mentioned, you've got extensive experience as a pilot. Can you just describe how that experience has helped you as you've grappled with policy making in this area?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Bob. First, thanks for having me with you this afternoon. This is a fascinating subject, and one of the things that I focused on throughout my 25 years was primary fighter and combat operations. What you're looking at right now across the spectrum of our developmental process here is a thought process that would leave the next 5 to 10 years under development and go to RDT&E hopeful dividends around the year 2030. What we're seeing right now in Ukraine is a couple of things. One is that hard power still rules. As much as we want to think it's not a combat attrition or combat casualty game, it certainly is. And the second side of this is that 4th generation airframes have no place any longer in the modern high threat fighter or combat environment. And that's just basically a common understanding that I think is missing from the dialogue today.
Where do you think that policymakers should make their investments, both for the short and the long term, especially with so many threats around the globe? You mentioned the Ukraine war. There's a lot going on now.
Yeah, Bob, the thing I would say right now is our policymakers, our leaders within the Air Force are focused on RDT&E, on science projects that will give us dividends sometime down the road. If you take a look at how costly these programs are, they're significant. The F-22 that we invested in for several years, that program cost right around $40 billion in modern day terms in order to give us what we thought was going to be 700 platforms. And we cut that buy down to something less than 200. The F-35 is that much more expensive. It's on the order of $66 billion in today's terms over the course of its time, and that's EMD development. What you get out of EMD, this engineering, manufacturing, and development process, is the ability to produce airframes. And we were supposed to be delivering, if you go back to 2014, we were supposed to be delivering on the order of 80 airframes a year, accepting it in the active duty Air Force. Right now, we're at 48. So this RDT&E premise is huge. So go one more area. Over the last 7 years, the Air Force has spent almost $300 billion on RDT&E programs. And the challenge out of that is squeezing something that the warfighter can use out of it today and in the near term and then in the long term. The AETP program is another one of those markers. This adaptive engine transition program appears to have delivered incredible benefits for the F-35 and the airframes down the road, but we have basically decided to scrap that program. That's $4 billion worth of scientific projects that we're just going to let go by the wayside. We need to focus on delivering things for the warfighter that begin to deliver now inside of the Davidson window and continue their development and and the RDT&E process that's going to give us something in 10 to 15 years down the road. But we can't abdicate today for that future.
You mentioned this is budget season right now and investing, and then some things in the president's proposal have been embraced by Congress. Other programs that you mentioned have not were not in his budget. But at the same time, as you know, Congress has a big say in this, so they change what the president proposes. What do you think? Is 3% enough across the Air Force? A little bit higher for the Air Force compared to the overall Pentagon, but also about programs that Congress should put back into the budget that Biden did not put in.
Yeah, the Congress has been able to change the budgeting process around the margins. Over the years, we've gone from 48 to 60 F-35As, for example, and then back down to 48. We're supposed to go down to 33. We're up to 48. That kind of thought process, the Congress is able to budget to balance. On the other side of the coin, we're buying things that we can't use, and Congress is injecting those into the budget as well. The F-15EX is a fourth generation platform, no matter which way you look at it. The Air Force had intended to buy 0 of those, no more fourth generation fighters of any sort going back to 2017. And as I understand it, it was zeroed out of the last 2 years' budgets. And this year, there's 24 more F-15EX is being inserted. That's Congress's prerogative, but we need more of the viable platforms, Bob, and we need more funding overall in order to take our readiness accounts and our operational tempo up to a point where the modern day fighter pilot has the competencies required to go out and engage in combat and do it well. We're at an all-time low on the number of platforms that we have in the active duty service. We're at an all-time low of the number of flying hours and sorties that our pilots are getting right now. And we need to change that, and Congress needs to be invested in that. The last of these that I'll tell you is that along with more F-35s, they need to relook at this adaptive engine technology program. The AETP program, Pratt & Whitney is going to deliver a gem when it comes out of their developmental process. And General Electric has already basically passed the thresholds that the government was looking for. We need to get both of those horses on the track, running side by side, and pick the best of them to meet the requirements, the cooling requirements, the thrust requirements, the power requirements, and then the range requirements that are going to be required of this system in a fight in the Pacific.
JV, can you talk about other countries, whether it's emerging technologies, engine technologies? Where do you see the threats as the biggest? And obviously that would be countries that are advancing their technologies, because we're not the only ones.
Yeah, China has got an incredible stealth program. We thought it was very well behind ours, but there's been some startling developments over the last 2 years, and pilots who have flown in that region have been surprised by what they've seen out of the stealth faculties of the Chinese. The Russians also have a program with that, but if you just look at what the Russians are able to do over the modern day environment, their SAM systems, the S-400 and the S-300, that is the older surface to air missile system that the Ukrainians are doing, they're both basically denying air power the ability to fly over the battlefield right now. And that's going to be something we face unless we've got fifth generation penetration capabilities, both with the bomber and with the fighter world. That's the first thing I would tell you. The second thing, from a friendly perspective, is that we've got lots of allies that are buying lots of fifth generation platforms. The Japanese, our ACC commander, Grace Kelly, has said that they're our #1 most powerful and potent ally in the region, but their stockpiles on air-to-air weaponry that would come off of the F-35, for example, those numbers are startlingly low in the numbers of 2 to 3 total sorties worth for their fleet. And so the United States industrial complex is answering the call for almost the entire world with regard to air power and the things that come off of it, those jets. And we need to step up our game across the board.
I want to ask you about the import of the war in Ukraine, specifically for the future. There's a lot of debate in Congress among Republicans and Democrats, but how important is it for Ukraine to win that war just going forward, especially with, we've seen China and Russia this week. Their ties are getting closer. China obviously has escalating tensions with Taiwan. How important is winning that war?
Well, winning it gives us time. So the thing that the Ukrainians are doing in extraordinary measure is they're wading into the threat. They're taking their incredible morale and the weapons that we give them and going in and fighting the Russians and doing great work. What we're seeing on the Russian side is basically the standard rubblization that they've always fought with since World War II. They're not afraid of pushing their folks forward into that meat blender, if you will, and taking territory at the cost of large numbers of personnel. We need to continue to supply the Ukrainians with viable weapons platforms. The Patriot system is going to be great for them. HIMARS, GIMLRs, the entire apparatus of 155 millimeter artillery. But what we're finding right now, Bob, is that the West is running out of their stockpiles. To compound that problem, the Ukrainians have suffered significant casualties, and the numbers have been downplayed over time. And so this is a game that has a fuse on it. When I say game, it's a war that it needs to be turned over and won by the Ukrainians in rapid fashion, because we're finding right now we don't have the weaponry with which to give them. Our stockpiles are drained, and they're running out of qualified and trained personnel to move to the front. So this has got the window on this is the next 6 months is my guess, and that's going to make it one way or another.
J.B. Venable, thanks for joining us. Without a doubt, the stakes are very high.
Thank you, Bob.
Our next guest is the Honorable Dr. Will Roper. Dr. Roper is the founder and CEO of the technology startup Terry. He is also a member of the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Board and previously served as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Air Force and Space Force. I was able to speak with him earlier today. Take a listen. Dr. Roper, thanks for joining us.
Bob, my pleasure. Thank you so much for asking me to talk about the future of national security.
Well, let's start with Istari. Tell us what you're doing on first engineering, metaverse, and what all that means to our vast audience. I'm not a defense expert, but if you can describe it in a way that all friends and family would understand.
Sure. There's been a trend I've been following since my Air Force days called digital engineering or digital transformation. And what it is being able to create technology completely digitally, because models and simulations are now so good that for many systems, they can be treated as a substitute for reality. And Formula One racing does this every year. Every team is digitally engineering its cars to be able to dominate the racing season. Well, that technology is now leaving Formula One and coming into other industries like aerospace, can build those systems the same way. And so I had a blast learning from teams like McLaren when I served as the acquisition exec for the Air Force and Space Force. Their techniques worked for airplanes and missiles, and I think it would work for satellites as well. But since leaving the Air Force, what I've realized is that there's one problem that's really holding back digital transformation broadly. And that's that to do it, you've got to integrate all of your models and simulations together, because no one single model or simulation represents a complex system on its own. It's spread across multiple different model types, from the structure to the environment to the performance. Even the regulation and requirements are all captured in different models. And you have to make one ecosystem that's consistent with each other. And that's a challenge. It took lots of engineers in the Air Force to do that for me. We had them. That was a great resource that the Air Force and Space Force had. But outside of it, and outside of large aerospace and defense companies, a lot of businesses don't have that engineering bench to do it. And so I ended up deciding to start a company called Astari, backed by Eric Schmidt, to tackle the problem of making model and simulation integration as easy as applications are on your phone.
And what this technology, where do you see it? Where's the potential in the short and long term?
I think you can see a hint of it in how software is developed today. You and I, with no coding skills, could start a software company today and get applications deployed likely on the same day we founded the company. There's so much automation that's in a software development stack today that the abstraction of the code from the application has allowed software to become ubiquitous and accessible by everyone. Now, what I think will happen in future, and hopefully will accelerate it in Astari, is that hardware will be the same way. You will be able to create it as easily as you do software, because we'll have effectively turned the hardware into software via models and simulations that are connected together that represent the structure or the physics, things that you currently can't access on the internet today. So I think it's an incredible time to be an engineer or a manager in cyber physical systems, because they're going to be as agile and adaptable and as upgradable as software has been. And if that sounds science fiction or like something out of the Matrix movies, you see it in Formula One racing. Every race, teams are creating thousands of digital twins of race cars, all optimized for different race day conditions that could occur. They're all equally real to the racing team, but the one that's the best fit for the specific race day conditions gets promoted to the physical world, printed in the physical world, and it's the best optimized car that could have been available prior. Well, that concept, I think, will go everywhere, and the power of it for military applications is obvious. Having every conceivable design on the shelf ready to go, and when national security demand it, you go to print, and you're printing the one that is the best fit for the circumstances. And like Formula One, you don't just print and be done, you instrument the physical twin, feed data back to those models and sims so that you can keep upgrading and improving and not have to be a static target. And over the course of a Formula One season, the car will change over 85%. The car that finishes the racing season is nothing like the car that began. And the car that began wouldn't even qualify for the last race. So that is software-like agility for hardware. And imagine if we applied it to things like drones or aircraft or satellites or uncrewed surface vessels or uncrewed ground vehicles for the Army. The power of it is that you keep improving. And from a defensive standpoint, you're never a static target for cyber attacks because your system is always changing. So I think it's the big thing. It's the big thing for our generation that will change the landscape of national security. It's not as much technologies that win on the battlefield themselves, though they matter. It's changing the entire process by which we create those battlefield winners. It's the engine for future warfighting that is the battle to be won. And I think that it's a great trend for the US and its allies and partners, because this is not an industrial revolution that can be undercut by cheap labor the way the last one was.
As far as change, some people like change, some people do not. Are there risks involved, and what are they that policymakers have to identify?
Of course, their problems never go away. They just change form. So we hope as humanity, we're just changing problems into better and better problems for the future. The biggest issue that policymakers and decision makers in general will have to wrap their head around is when to trust their models and simulations as true authoritative virtualizations for specific functions. And just because you've got a model and simulation doesn't mean it's a substitute for reality. There is a hard calculus that has to be looked at for what error terms are calculated or captured accurately. And so for one scenario, you might choose to trust a model or some. For another one, you won't. And if you're wrong, then the consequences could be catastrophic. So just like with acquisitions or developments today, there will be key risks, there will be key failures. But what's exciting about this new problem space that we're moving into is that many of those failures will occur at digital speed. You can learn and adapt and get back on your feet faster than you could if you're relying on physical prototyping and testing as your only way to get feedback. It's expensive, it's slow, and it's environmentally impactful. So collapsing that down into a few minutes' time is such a powerful concept. It's hard to even predict how big it will be on the national security landscape. But I've watched Formula One teams redesign a car, retest and recertify in 3 minutes. That's their feedback loop. So I can't wait till that's common in aerospace and defense.
How does the U.S. compare to other countries in this space?
Well, the good news is Formula One is ahead of everyone. So you can feel overwhelmed when you see how far they've advanced the tradecraft for digital testing and digital certification. I certainly felt like we were at the very beginning of a very long journey when I was the acquisition exec for the Air Force. The good news is that some of the techniques that have been applied inside of U.S. defense are actually leading in a world standpoint. I've helped quite a few companies outside of defense to apply some of the techniques that worked for us inside of the Air Force. So that's great. The military is not significantly behind for once, and Formula One provides a guiding star that we can follow. So that's really great news. Now here's the downside. There's only a few dozen, maybe 4 dozen companies that are touted as like shining stars, as lighthouses for these Industry 4.0 practices. Many of them are in China. So what Formula One does is on display for everyone. The potency of those techniques is obvious. And so if the US doesn't move with urgency to set the conditions, the standards by which technology will be made in future, it may find itself forced into those that have been created in China. So this is an area of great urgency. If there was one wish that I could have for our country, it would be to lead this next transformation of how technology is created. Because if we lead this transformation, it's not a transformation that's in isolation. It transforms all of the industries around it, right? What a powerful concept. And you can kind of, if you look back over history, it's technologies that change how you make other technologies that are often the most impactful. They're the exponential curves. We've seen it and are seeing it right now with tools like generative AI. It's starting to change how we make other technologies. Mm-hmm. This is now bringing that same kind of exponential curve into hardware so that in future, you're a developer. You're not a software developer. You're not a hardware developer. You're a digital developer. And your system today may be one that needs those models and simulations to access the physical world in digital form. But the next system may be something that's in the pure software sphere and back and forth. So it's a really exciting time where things are converging. And when I speak to students on this and they say, what kind of engineering should I go do to be good at this? Anyone you want. Everyone's going to be a digital engineer in future. So you'll still focus where you're passionate, electrical, mechanical systems. But what'll be awesome in the future is you'll be able to explore parts of engineering design outside of your discipline and do it safely. And that's just going to make problem solving and creating things just more impactful, a little more like Tony Stark in his workshop. He's a one-man army creating technology like a Fortune 500 company. But how does he do it? Well, if he's creating things, all of the models and simulations he's using to design and look at performance, they automatically connect with each other. And the movies do a great way of imagining how this will be in future with the aid of some pretty snazzy special effects. Well, that's not a far future. Connecting those models and simulations together so that we can engineer like Tony Stark, maybe minus the holograms. That's the near future. That's the future I'm trying to help create.
It's an exciting future. We've run out of time. Dr. Roper, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, and just hope everyone's having a great day.
Thanks again to Dr. Roper for speaking with us earlier today. And now it's time for the sponsor perspective portion of our program. Please welcome Amy Gowder, President and CEO of Defense and Systems at GE Aerospace. She will be joined by my colleague, Matt Steinmetz, Executive Director of the Hill Events.
Amy Gowder, thank you so much for being with us today for this very, very important dialogue. To get us started today, I understand we're at a really pivotal moment in military aviation history. Why is that? What are you most excited about at this moment?
So first, thanks for having me. Let me tell you a bit of relevant history about GE Aerospace that leads to the future. 80 years ago, Matt, we developed the first jet engine for the US, and we did it in 10 months from design to test. And we power 2/3 of the combat air force today and 2/3 of the rotary wing aircraft. And I have a very broad portfolio that spans into tankers and transport, as well as even marine ships, surface Navy ships. So we have a broad history, a history of innovation, of bringing innovation to market quickly and at a scale. And, all of those are important right now. As you look at the geopolitical tensions, you look at how advanced technology is becoming, it's really an exciting time. So that advanced technology, we're applying it to all of our platforms. And I'll give you 2 examples. The T901 is the aircraft powers the rotary wing aircraft. It's replacing our T700 that's on all the Blackhawks and Apaches. It's a workhorse. It has 100 million hours of flight time. The T901 with this advanced technology does it even better. So we've used advanced materials, we've used additive manufacturing, and all that is giving 50% more power, 25% more fuel efficiency. And with the additive manufacturing, it's reduced the number of parts. So it's simpler, it's easier to maintain. So technology is really advanced quickly, and we're applying it to the benefit of the warfighter. Our XA100 is another great example. So that adaptive engine technology enables what the warfighter needs right now, and that's 30% more range. So the adaptive engine controls, the new architecture allows that increased range, increased speed, lower fuel efficiency. 20% acceleration is the speed. And then those advanced materials, we call them ceramic matrix composites, also enables the jet to be cooled and more fuel efficient. So it enables the cooling for the overall aircraft, and thermal capacity is definitely what we need with all these advanced electronics. So you take the advancements in technology, the great history of GE Aerospace and bringing technology to market, and that's why it's such an exciting time in the military.
For sure. So regarding your XA100 engine, which you just mentioned, the president's budget came out about 2 weeks ago, and it did not fund the adaptive engine transition program. What does this say about the future of propulsion? Is the Pentagon looking to push the next generation of engines, the next generation adaptive propulsion program, or do they have different priorities altogether?
Yeah. So, it's no secret there's lots of geopolitical tensions, and other nations are investing in technology to advance their capabilities and create really a contested environment. And, propulsion has long been the asymmetrical advantage for the United States. And we have advanced this technology. I mentioned 30% more range, which you need in a contested environment, 20% more acceleration, which you need the speed to get in and out. And we've proven it through the testing that's come to market. And really, Congress has the last say in the funding. And we've had almost 50 members, bipartisan support for the adaptive engine technology. They recognize this technology delivers the capability you need in those contested environments. And frankly, the United States Air Force has been very strategic in launching the adaptive engine technology program. They knew they needed it, and Congress has funded it for $4 billion. So we believe it does make F-35 stronger in the future in this contested environment.
You mentioned the potential for generational leaps forward today. What's driving these advances and to see improvements, like the ones you were describing?
Certainly. Sustainability has a lot of what we've been driving today in the commercial market. And with GE Aerospace, we have a long history of sharing the technologies back and forth between the military and the commercial. And those composite matrix ceramics I mentioned earlier that are critical to the advancements in fuel efficiency, we've had those on our LEAP engine since 2016, $10 million flight hours. And it really shows that the technology is ready. It's here now, and it's driving what we want for the environment. And then as you apply those technologies in military, it's enabling better mission. So it's not only good for cost savings and fuel efficiency and environmental reduction in pollution, but it also enables these longer missions. Other advancements I haven't even talked about, hybrid electric is a great example where we're taking propulsion technologies with high power voltage. And again, back to material science, we have a silicon carbide that's really advancing the state of those high voltage, high power electronics. And you apply that in the military space. So let's say the Army, the ground forces even, you can think of like silent watch. So it not only enables the mission, reduce logistics dependency, it also is a quiet, so tanks can move quieter. So we just see all of these advancements often driven by sustainability or commercial reasons, then applied in the military setting. Or we see, like with the adaptive that I talked about, those adaptive engine controls are going to feed back into the commercial environment, again, for better fuel efficiency, better range. It's a very symbiotic relationship driving these advancements.
Sure. I want to talk about the state of play of the supply chain and in particular post-COVID. There's huge pressure on both the commercial and military aviation sides to meet customer demand. What steps are you taking to deliver for customers on time and to strengthen your supply chains?
Yeah, certainly. The whole industry has definitely experienced the challenges with the loss of talent. And we're committed to lean. So lean manufacturing, our lean operating system, really drives a systemic and systematic way to attack these problems. So back to T700, our workhorse. We had an advanced quality initiative we applied using those lean techniques, getting to the root cause, and it improved 90% defect generation. So it's proven. We are applying these same tools and techniques with our supply base. So we very publicly went out and talked about how we sent mechanics to our suppliers that was having trouble in a commercial program. We've done the same on the military. On our F-110 combustor case, we went to the supplier, we did a value stream map, we identified those constraints. It's really that hands-on systemic technique of lean that yields, in some cases 2 to 5 times the output, 90% reduction in defects. It's really those quality disruptions as well as flow that's needed to restore the supply base to the health and the performance we need. And that's through a systematic approach and partnership.
To close us out in this era of increased geopolitical competition, what do you see as the key technologies currently in development that are going to maximize U.S. national security and military capabilities?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about adaptive technology and material science. Another area that material science's advancements are applying is hypersonics. So if you think about the high temperatures and the really accelerated speeds, just to give you a sense, the propulsion technology working on for hypersonics could go 3,800 miles per hour. That's going from New York to London in just an hour, just to give you our preference. And it's that really the ceramic matrix composites and some other material science advancements, rotating detonation engines. That's really what's going to enable the hypersonics field to advance. I talked about hybrid electric and high voltage. That's another area we see electrification being needed in all these applications, whether in the air or on the ground. And then finally, I'll leave you with low cost. So we certainly see unmanned collaborative combat assets are critical. So how do we take the advancements in advanced manufacturing to enable the low cost so that they can get as much scale as they need in these combat situations?
Well, Amy, we're out of time, but I want to thank you so much for being our guest today. And of course, thank you to GE Aerospace for sponsoring today's program. Fantastic partners, and we can't thank you enough.
Thanks, Matt.
And thanks again to Amy Gowder and to GE Aerospace for their support of today's program. My next guest represents Virginia's 1st District in Congress and is the chair of the Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee, which is part of the House Armed Services Committee. Please welcome Congressman Rob Wittman. Thank you for joining us, Congressman.
Well, good afternoon. Great to be with you.
Well, it's budget season. A lot of talk about the budget, and with divided government now, President Biden has proposed a budget. Can you talk about your thoughts on it, specifically as it relates to the defense and air power?
Absolutely. Well, listen, I think it falls far short of what we need to do to make sure we're countering China. We've seen in the president's budget a proposed 3.2% increase. We know the rate of inflation is 6%. So we know it falls short in just keeping up with what we did last year. We see the Chinese advertising that they're increasing their budget by 7%. And we know that they're not transparent about how much they spend. We know that it's much, much more than that. So we're even falling behind in what the Chinese are saying that they are spending. And we see the real life exposition of what they're doing in building ships and new aircraft. Those things are pretty startling and sobering for the nation. So if we look too in relation to other areas of the budget that are being increased, we see non-defense discretionary spending increasing at a 7% rate versus 3.2% for defense discretionary. So again, imbalance is there. If you look at what's happening across the spectrum, whether it's ships, but more specifically aircraft, we see we're still on the path for this divest to invest strategy. Listen, it's good that we're building 85 F-35s. I think that keeps us on track. I should say 83 F-35s. It keeps us somewhat on track. There's 24 F-15EXs in the budget this year, but it's going to leave us far short of the number of aircraft that the Air Force says that they need in order to perform the mission. So all of those elements, I think, are challenging. We see, too, that there are no F-18s in this year's budget. The Navy still hasn't executed the 20 that were authorized and appropriated in the 21 budget. There's still an agreement pending between Boeing and the Navy on getting those aircraft built. The good news, though, is we are on track with B-21. B-21 is shown to be a successful program. Deep penetrating strike bomber is what we need. This aircraft is performing. It's staying on time and on budget. That's a good news story within this. Continued funding exists within the budget for that. So I think in those air platform areas, we're in a good place. The challenge, though, is on the tactical aircraft side, we are still retiring many more aircraft than what we're building. And listen, I'm not a mathematician, but it's hard for me to see how we do addition by subtraction. It's hard for me to see what we are doing in relation to the capacity that the Chinese are building with their J-20 aircraft, also what they're doing in next generation aircraft. I want to make sure, too, we're staying on track with our next generation air defense systems, better known as NGAD, and also the unmanned component about that. We need not only that, but we need to make sure that we have a full set of sensors from space to Earth to make sure we have a sensor suite that can withstand what we know the Chinese will do to try to take away information from us. And the information is going to be the key in the battle space. So I think that those things are incredibly important. So
what do you think is going to be, there's some, certainly Democrats and some Republicans very skeptical of the Pentagon's budget. They want reductions. However, there are a lot of Republicans and a fair amount of Democrats who do want to boost defense funding. Now that the House is in Republican hands, you mentioned inflation at 6%, which is a decent point. Where do you think that number is going to be? I know it's going to be a roller coaster and you have a lot of cooks in the kitchen, but what do you think the number should be?
Well, listen, I think it needs to be at least comparable to the rate of inflation. So we're well short of that with the president's budget. I think that has to be a starting point. And there are a number of things that I think have to be addressed in the budget. We talk about we talk about aircraft, we talk about F-35s, we talk about F-18s, we talk about the other elements of air power, F-15EXs. One element that's very concerning is not just the slower growth of those aircraft, but retiring advanced aircraft. The Air Force wants to retire F-22s, the most advanced air-to-air combat jet in the world. It just doesn't make sense to me that they want to retire, 20 plus of those aircraft. So those are things too that are on the radar screen. And so it's not just about, what are we doing to keep up with inflation, but it's what do we do too to get to those areas that we know are now going to be extracted from the president's budget and that we're going to have to be able to put in. Remember, if you put those things back in, you have to find some other place to be able to get those dollars. So I think that we're going to have to be there. I think folks understand the true challenge that we had from China, the urgency that we have to act in order to counteract China. And remember, this whole idea of divest to invest, where we say, well, we're going to divest in legacy platforms, and somewhere out in the future, beyond the fight up, the 5-year defense plan, we're going to fund new platforms to replace those. We don't have the time to do that. The threat is now. And I think by any measure, we know the threat is right at our doorstep. So the question is how do we make sure we have that capacity? Listen, I am not in any way, shape, or form opposed to retiring legacy platforms. But you can't retire them and then the plan be, well, we're going to wait outside the fight up 5 years and then we'll build something new. The Chinese are not going to wait around. And in the meantime, they're going to be building capacity and capability that far exceeds what we have. So that's the urgency that has to be reflected in this year's defense appropriations as well as our authorization.
Since the election, I've interviewed a number of ranking members, whether that be at the subcommittee level, who are now chairman or committee chair, and obviously very frustrated last year. A lot of them, Republicans, have said that they were not getting the level of communication or response to letters, whether it's retiring aircraft or other issues. Has the level of communication from the Biden administration improved since the House flipped?
Well, only marginally. I would say that we still aren't getting the depth of information that we need to make proper decisions. And remember, the best way that we can perform our job is to make sure we have in-depth information. And that's critically important. And many times what we're having to do is we're having to step outside the realm of the Pentagon to be able to get that information, to gather those data points from others out there that are part of this effort, both in the hardware and software realm, but also those folks that deal with this each and every day. That shouldn't be the way it goes about, because we know that decisions are being made within the Pentagon. It's incredibly important for us to understand how are those decisions being made and what's the information that they are using to make those decisions. It's fine for us to get information from other sources, but to truly inform ourselves about how the Pentagon is making decisions, we need to be informed about the information that they are using to do that. And if they want us in any way, shape, or form to understand a decision, ones that we may disagree with, then it's incumbent upon them to give us that information, the information that they use for decision making. If they don't, then it creates on our side either assumptions that we have to make without that information, or filling in the blanks, which I think is not the way we feel best in understanding what the Pentagon is doing. But in many situations, that's what we're relegated to, because we don't have the full scope of information when we ask for it from the Pentagon.
Congressman, do you think that Congress has been briefed adequately on two remarkable recent events, the Chinese spy balloon that was shot down, as well as the Air Force drone that was shot down by or clipped by the Russians? Have you gotten enough information, or do you think the administration should be sharing more with both Congress and the American public?
Right. Well, listen, we've gotten basic information. All of it's classified. We've gotten basic information about what was recovered. Where is it as we speak? What are they doing to analyze what was on that platform? What are they missing of what they saw when the platform was in the air? But all of those things are classified. So I would say we've gotten the very baseline information, but the details of what was that platform able to do? What do we think it did? what do we believe, too, that it discovered as it flew over that wasn't related to gathering things like signal intelligence or taking photographs or those things that are normal parts of intelligence gathering? One of the things that I think is very disturbing about this is I think the Chinese were purposefully sending this platform over the United States to see what our reaction was. Because remember, we heard the Pentagon say, "Oh, don't worry about it. You know, we're hiding things, we're moving things around, we're closing things down." Well, this platform sensed every bit of that. So if you were in the Chinese shoes and you were saying, "What are the vulnerabilities? How do we exploit what we see the United States do in reaction to this flying over?" You would want to know that so that you could counter what the United States is doing. To me, that was the most troubling element of what happened with this. I want to hear, too, what we believe the Chinese were able to gather, not just in what the platform was able to absorb as far as transmissions of communications and those sorts of things, but what do we think they were able to gather in observing what we did in reaction to this platform?
I was watching the debate on the House floor with the creation of the new Committee on China, and I was struck how bipartisan it was. And then I watched the first hearing, which was at night, and I was struck by how bipartisan. Now, I know both sides of the aisle like to bash China, but what's the opportunity here of bipartisanship, and you don't hear a lot of this, on a major issue in the House, and how does that relate to our ability to keep modernizing the Pentagon so we can compete with China and others?
Well, listen, I think it's a great opportunity. I agree with you. It is incredibly bipartisan. It's on par with the House Armed Services Committee, which has been incredibly bipartisan. So it's a real honor for me to serve in leadership positions there on the Armed Services Committee, but also as the senior member on the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. It's a great opportunity for us. The Select Committee can gather information, can also draft legislation. It can't pass legislation, but it can be the subject matter expert on what needs to be done in order to counter China. And I really believe what we need to look at is what are the most important strategic places that we can be in isolating China? How do we make sure that we don't allow them to get a stronger foothold to displace the United States, or in other ways to be transactional in an exploitive way with other nations around the world? And that's exactly what China is doing now. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for us to put forth our policies and how we deal with that, and also to use this to go to our friends and allies and say, join us in combating what China is doing around the world, which is a threat to, I think, nations around the globe. And look at what China does in a very transactional way. They are exploitive with other countries. We just went through today with the AFRICOM commander, General Langley, about what's happening in Africa with China and what they're doing to exploit those African countries. We see the same thing now happening in Central America. So there's great opportunities for us to affect foreign policy, to affect national security policy, and for that matter, to affect homeland security policy, because many of the things that are going on are happening right within our own borders, whether it's Chinese-sourced fentanyl coming across the border, Confucius Institutes, what they're doing to recruit intellectual talent from places like Los Alamos. All of those things collectively show that China is very focused on using every mechanism possible. We're used to the aspect of the Cold War where things were really on a military level because Russia didn't have an economic relationship with us. China has such intricate economic relationships in the United States that they know that they can hold us at risk economically, strategically, and even for that matter, they see with elements of our social fabric here. You saw today the hearing on TikTok. I mean, that's another element for them to infiltrate and gather data to use that against us. So at every turn, the Chinese are not just limiting themselves to the kinetic realm, to the military realm, to the strategic realm. They're looking at every way to weaken the United States.
Last question. Spending is a big issue this year with House Republicans trying to clamp down on spending. You've got to pass a budget resolution, though. That's the first step before you can pass individual appropriations bills. You know you're not going to get any help on that budget resolution. It's a slim majority in the House. Are you confident that House Republicans will be able to pass a budget this spring?
I am. Listen, there's been a lot of great conversations about what needs to be in there. I think people realize, too, that, with a very slim majority, none of us are going to get everything that we want. In a perfect world, you'd say, I want to get 100% of what I think needs to happen in the fiscal realm to manage this nation's finances. Realistically, we're not going to do that. What we need to do is to find the bill that aligns itself with the largest number of members, and that has to be over 218. I think that we can do that. I think people understand that if we don't do that, if we don't have the ability to put our plan forward and have it that gathers 218 votes, it's going to be very difficult for us to negotiate on anything with the Senate or the president. So that's the starting point. And I feel very good about what's happening in these listening sessions to take all this information and put together something that can get 218 votes. And I think we have to do that sooner than later. I think the sooner that we put that out there, the sooner that we have that debate, the sooner that we get it passed out of the House, the more room that we will have in negotiating a deal that I think would be acceptable to the majority of folks on our side of the aisle. Actually, I believe it has to get to 218. But the way we do that is to make sure we get our budget framework passed out and the things that we need to use to negotiate as we go forward with the debt ceiling debate.
Yes, it will be a tight vote for that budget resolution. They usually are with small majorities. Congressman, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Senator Tammy Duckworth of Illinois is an Iraq War veteran, a Purple Heart recipient, and was among the first Army women to fly combat missions during Operation Iraqi Freedom. She was also the former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Welcome, Senator.
For having me.
Well, first question I want to ask you, your vast experience in the military, military hero, how has that translated to Congress, specifically on the Senate Armed Services Committee, in pushing, in oversight, in legislating, maybe helping your colleagues understand things that they would not understand because of your experience?
Thank you. Well, I'm not a hero. The men on my crew who saved my life were the heroes. But I will tell you that the military experience I bring with me to Congress serves me in a couple of different ways. One is, of course, as you've mentioned, I bring a perspective of the everyday soldier who's had to carry out missions and had to use the equipment that we on the Armed Services Committee either fund or not fund, and the policies that we put forward, and having to live that and sort of giving that perspective of everything that we're asking our troops to do on a regular basis. Having been a commander of a unit, to be able to bring that perspective forward. The other aspect of it is that it actually allows me to have a point of commonality with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. So even from my first days when I first served in the House, I started working with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who were also Iraq War vets, who were also military vets, and were able to expand that friendship, that point of commonality of joint military service, even into other areas beyond my work on the Armed Services Committee.
Can you talk about modernization, where we need to go? There are threats all around the globe. We have a raging war in Ukraine. But specifically on U.S. modernization, fifth-generation platforms, advanced engines, there are so many things that we have to advance in order to compete with our rivals, and it seems to be like rivals are they're building by the day.
They are, but the United States has several advantages, right? One is the capability of our non-military industrial base. We have a lot of innovation. We are far more innovative than any other nation on the face of the earth. And that is really something we should be harnessing. I also think, if you're talking about fifth generation, sixth generation platforms, we have to look at the fact, frankly, that in the aviation and air power, that development is no longer linear. It's been linear since the Wright brothers flew the first aircraft, and it was linear in terms of how we fought war from the first biplanes in World War II going into in World War I, going into World War II and onwards. But now we're also looking at space, and we're looking at all the different ways that we can use air power that may not be that linear of, faster, stronger, heavier, bigger, more lethal. It may be more relying on, as we have already seen, drones, but some of these drones don't have to be the biggest, the fastest, the heaviest. So it may be swarms of drones that are gathering information. I think of the way I used to fly air assault missions is that, you would have the OH-58s, right? The scouts would go out first and look in front. Well, maybe it's not the scout that's going out first. Maybe that scout aircraft is now controlling a fleet of drones in front of me. So looking at what we can do with forces that are going into suborbital flight and maybe re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, all sorts of stuff that we should be looking at. And so that development is no longer linear like it has been through our history. And that is why I think we really need to have the maximum technology and acquisition flexibility and take advantage in the United States of the civilian capabilities that we have beyond just the military industrial complex.
Senator, as you know, there's a lot of politics about the defense spending level. Some want it lower, some want it significantly higher. The Biden administration came in with a proposal of just over 3%. My last guest, Congressman Whitman from Virginia, noted that inflation's at 6%. Is 3% enough? And how do you see the defense budget debate going forward this spring?
I don't want to put an actual number on it, but I do think we need to increase our spending in some areas. For example, we need to make serious investments in our submarine force. It is one of our areas of where we lead, continue to lead, and certainly a pacing item for us as we look towards the future. But there are still places that we can also save money as well, and we need to be serious about that. So I think for me, it's again, going back to what I said, acquisition flexibility. We need to make those investments where we need to, but there are ways that we can also accelerate the DoD's acquisitions cycle, make it cheaper, working with civilian counterparts, maximizing our use of all types of industries. We've got last year, the Defense Innovation Unit opened a new office in Chicago. That is really going to be better at helping us tap the Midwestern industrial base. Similarly, Manufacturing Times Digital, also located in Chicago, is one of the manufacturing institutes that is founded in partnership between civilian institutions and DoD. So I think we need to look at ways we can save money in that acquisition process and that development process. But there's going to be some very sort of classic military spending that's going to require more spending, not the least of which is our submarine forces.
What about the future of Ukraine aid? Basically, the talking point from the White House is we're going to do this as long as it takes. And the talking point from Kevin McCarthy is not going to give Ukraine a blank check. The support for Ukraine has been fairly strong in polls, but we're seeing it slip, certainly among Republicans. Where do you see that going? Do you think there's enough support in divided government to give Ukraine what they need to defeat Russia?
I think very much so, especially as Russia continues to be a very bad actor in terms of their mistreatment and inhumane treatment of civilians. The fact that the International Criminal Court just published, this case against Vladimir Putin is critically important. And I think that there is very strong bipartisan support, at least here in the Senate, and especially the Senate leadership, for continuing to provide aid to Ukraine.
We've had some time now since the spy balloon from China was shot down. What's your analysis of that? Many experts are saying this was a test for the United States. Some said the balloon should have been shot down before, but the White House said, well, that wouldn't have been safe. But really remarkable brashness from China. What was your take of it, and what do we have to be wary of in the future?
Well, I'm wary of how many balloons are up there. I think one of the things we learned was that there are a lot of balloons floating up there that we need to know more about. And many of them are benign and are being put up there by research institutions like universities and like. And as the chairwoman of the aviation subcommittee on the Commerce Committee, and we're going through FAA reauthorization right now, we, I think, have to have a real serious conversation about how do we track these aircraft that are floating at these very high levels, some of them, above commercial airspace, but below space itself, and who controls that airspace, and maybe we need to start looking at more requiring these balloons to be transmitting their locations. And so for me, the takeaway was how many are up there, and are we not tracking them all?
There's a big hearing today on TikTok. Do you think that TikTok should be banned? I mean, my kids are on TikTok, and there's some concern among some Democrats that if you ban TikTok, there could be actually a backlash among younger voters. But there's obviously a national security major concern with TikTok right now.
Well, I think there'd be a backlash in my own household because I have a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old who are desperate to get TikTok on their phones and have not been allowed to have TikTok on their phones. I have real concerns with TikTok as long as it is owned by a Chinese company. We know that the PRC has this relationship with their businesses that are really controlled by the Chinese government. There's a sharing of information. There's even joint efforts within the PRC's industries and their government, for example, stealing information and stealing intellectual property from American firms, like they did when they stole from Lockheed Martin, and solved problems with their own jets landing gear when they stole information on landing gear on the F-35 development, for example. So I have real concerns about TikTok. I'm glad it is banned from government devices. I'm not sure where I am about outright banning it. I'm leaning more towards that. But certainly the fact that there's no governance structure, right? No way that we can force a requirement to govern who puts what on this platform that's really harming our children.
What are your biggest concerns over the short term and long term? Some people say maybe it could be short term, but certainly China's aggression with Taiwan and the South China Sea, but around the globe, obviously there's some Iran, North Korea. But what keeps you up when you get these classified briefings of what's a real danger, an immediate danger?
Well, no, I'm certainly worried about Taiwan, and we need to invest more in Taiwan and ramp up the speed at which they can become that porcupine that we talked about on the Armed Services Committee. I passed the Taiwan Defense Act to create a National Guard partnership with Taiwan so that we can train the National Guard in Taiwan the way we train the military in Ukraine. Since the annexation of Crimea, the National Guard has been training, and in fact, the Illinois National Guard has been providing some of that training of the Ukrainian forces now for the last 8 years, which is one of the reasons why the Ukrainian military has been able to fight so well, is because they've been trained for the last 8 years. We need to do the same thing and ramp up that training and equipping of Taiwan in the short term. But I also think, the thing that keeps me up at night is the fact that the PRC is everywhere, and we are not everywhere the PRC is, and we need to be a presence around the world, in particular in the Indo-Pacific region, and not just militarily. The military is important. Maintaining the rule of law, the freedom of navigation is really important, but we need to be there as a presence as well. What I've heard from countries like Indonesia and Cambodia and other places is that they want America to be present. We are still the partner of choice economically. They don't want to have to choose between the U.S. and the PRC, but they actually want us there. They want us to be a presence, and it is important that we start showing up. And what keeps me up at night is also what's happening in Africa. I don't think that we have visibility in Africa the way we should.
That's a good point. I did want to ask you about the budget. Defense officials have been frustrated with Congress because, as you know, there's been a lot of CRs, a lot of punting on funding. How important is it, and there is talk in both the House and Senate of trying to do the regular order and not put everything together in an omnibus and have hearings so bills can move individually. Can that happen in the divided Senate right now?
I don't know that we can. I don't know that skipping an omnibus is the way forward, but I will tell you that passing a defense budget in a timely manner is absolutely critical, and it's the right thing to do for the American taxpayers. Studies have shown that if we would just pass a defense budget on a timely manner, we would actually save something like $40 billion. That's a lot of money we can save simply by doing things on time. And certainly we in Congress need to do a better job of getting things done in a timely manner. And I certainly do not want a CR. I can't imagine getting into a CR at the start of a 2-year cycle that will begin the presidential cycle. And we'll just end up kicking the can down the road for the next 2 years. And, that is something I do not want to see. So I do want to see the budget passed this year and in a timely way.
Well, we'll be watching. Senator, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
And now for my final guest of the afternoon, I'm pleased to introduce the Honorable Frank Kendall, the 26th Secretary of the Air Force. I was able to speak with him last week, just hours after Russian jets downed a U.S. drone over the Black Sea. We spoke about that, as well as other news broke, as well as other issues and priorities important to the U.S. Air Force. Take a listen to my interview. Secretary Kendall, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Bob. Thank you.
Well, we've got some breaking news that's just happened, and this involves an Air Force drone that has been apparently knocked down by Russian jets. Can you tell us a little bit more about this event?
I can tell you what I know, and I think it's pretty much what the commander has provided. We were conducting a routine surveillance operation in the Black Sea, and Russian aircraft with very unsafe practices interfere with the flight of the aircraft and cause it to crash. I mean, that's the short version of this. We're looking into the details of that and trying to understand exactly what happened.
And is this, just as a quick follow-up, is this highly unusual, especially if it's over the Black Sea? That's over international waters, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The MQ-9 aircraft, a drone, unmanned drone, was in international waters conducting a routine flight. And this is extremely unusual. I'm not aware of an incident like this that's occurred, over the last year of conflict over there.
Okay. Other news, certainly, of the month and going forward into the spring is the budget season. Can you talk about the Air Force's proposed budget and why it's important? Remember, there are some in the Democratic Party and some in the Republican Party who want to cut defense spending, but there are a lot of threats around the world. Why is it important for Congress to approve this request?
The main reason is because of the threat and the need to move as quickly as possible to keep pace with the threat. I'm back in government basically because I'm concerned about primarily our facing challenges, military modernization program. That's China, People's Republic of China, of course. I've been concerned about this for over a dozen years now. They've been investing very heavily in systems which are intended to defeat the American ability to project power in the Western Pacific, as well as expanding their military generally around the world on a number of different fronts. But a primary concern to me from the point of view of the Air Force and the Space Force is the increasing range of threats to our ability to project power and to protect the joint force.
Now, some critics of the administration have said, who are backers of more defense spending, have said, well, if inflation high, asking for a 3% jump in Pentagon spending, that's not enough. What do you say to that?
We had a pretty large increase in our budget in FY23, so we're adding on to that increase which has already taken place. For the Department of the Air Force, our increase is a little over 5%. And the Space Force is even higher than that. The Air Force is slightly lower. The increases we're getting are going to take care of the things that we need the most to move forward, to modernize, to transform really both the Air and the Space Force into the forces we're going to need going forward. Now, I'm very comfortable about the level of budget we have. We are looking at the risk between the near term, the far term, and so on. And I'm prioritizing to some degree the investments we need in modernization. But I'm comfortable with the other parts of the budget and what they finance.
You've mentioned modernization, and in a recent speech, you really leaned into that. But what does that mean? We have a vast audience. I'm not a defense expert. Can you describe it in a way that we can all understand?
Sure. The force structure that we have in space and for the Air Force is essentially the one we've had for quite a long time. We have fighter planes, we have bombers. In space, we have satellites that provide various services to us. What China recognized going back maybe 30 years is that the U.S. depends upon a small number of high-value assets in order to project combat power forward. The things on that list include, first of all, aircraft carriers, of course, but forward air bases, in which we have a relatively small number, and then a relatively small number of satellites in orbit in very predictable paths. So China's been acquiring the means to attack all of those assets and others, such as key logistics nodes or command and control nodes. So they feel that a lot of missiles of various ranges, increasingly going out to longer ranges, to attack all of those assets. They've also been modernizing their conventional forces in order to take us on in some of the areas that we depended upon for a long time, like stealth, for example. They've been fielding hypersonic weapons as well, which are very difficult to intercept. So there are a range of things that have happened on the threat side that have put us at risk, and we have got to respond to that. And those require some pretty fundamental changes in some cases.
We live in interesting times, and recently, we had the China spy balloon and then other objects that were shot out of the sky. What are the lessons learned? It's been a little while since that turbulent time. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, it was an interesting exercise, and I think it brought home, I think, to the American people very visibly that we do have competitors in the world, and that they are capable of taking actions against us. The surveillance balloon, which was a Chinese surveillance balloon, does not pose a high threat to the United States, but it made, I think, for the American public, it made it very visible that we do have an adversary who's willing to take that kind of an operation against us in order to collect information. Not that much higher in altitude than the balloon are the satellites that are going over our heads all the time, but they're not as visible. And the other threats that I mentioned earlier are out there too, and are inimical to our interests, and we have to respond to those. So I think that in a sense that the balloon was made that much more apparent, that we have that problem to worry about. The balloons per se are not, however, that much of a threat to the country.
Are we going to get more information on the balloon, because transparency in these kind of situations is very important, educating the public? A lot of people were very frightened by what they saw in the air.
What I think we put out publicly is it was a surveillance balloon. We're confident of that. We have some pretty good information about what was on. We did, as I think it's also been made public, try to recover some of the debris from the balloon that we shot down. I don't see any reason personally why we shouldn't make that information public as we have it. Let people know. The Chinese already know, obviously, what was on their balloon, and they know how we got access to it. So I don't think there's any reason why we can't be fairly forthcoming about what types of sensors and what we think that they were looking for in terms of information.
As far as technology, just generally speaking, over the last 50 years, it's been remarkable of where we've come. What can you say about what kind of gets you excited about technology in the military sense, and where we're going in the next 5 to 15, 20 years? I know some things you can't say, but what can you say?
No, there are a number of areas in which we can take advantage of emerging technologies and move forward. I can start with commercial space technologies. They're going to give us the opportunity to have much less expensive and more proliferated and more survivable space architectures. Artificial intelligence, various facets of artificial intelligence, machine learning, pattern recognition, data analytics are going to be valuable to us as we try to sort through massive amounts of information and draw conclusions from it and decide more efficiently and effectively what kind of action to take on our own part. There are a number of things in the area of autonomy in particular, and artificial intelligence contributes to that, where we'll be able to take human beings out of some of the high-risk situations we'd had to put them in previously. One of my initiatives in the budget is an uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft, which is essentially an uncrewed drone that flies with a fighter. There may be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of these per fighter airplane, and that they're used to make that fighter much, much more capable, expand on his capabilities, and give him a small formation, if you will, to control, to affect whatever he's trying to affect against an adversary. So there are a number of things like that that are making things possible for us. The whole area of communications and command and control, battle management is another one. There are emerging sensors that are changing the game as well. So there's a wide array of technologies. What we have to do is seize upon which of those technologies have the greatest opportunity for us, and then figure out how to put them into an operational application as efficiently and effectively as possible. We spent much of the last year working our way through some of those problems, and the budget we just submitted, now asks for the money to move forward and apply those technologies to the threat that I talked about. So it's critically important to us that we get timely passage of both authorizations and appropriations this year. We need that money, but even more, we need the authority to start doing those things so we can get things fielded as quickly as possible.
Have you been frustrated? In passing defense bills used to be easier. They used to be more bipartisan. We live in polarizing times, and what you've just talked about is that the defense budget is going to be quite a battle. Honestly, is that concerning going forward?
Our defense bills have been pretty bipartisan, actually. We've had pretty good cooperation between Republicans and Democrats about both our authorization bill and our appropriations bill. There are always some issues that we end up arguing about, trying to sort out, and there have been delays. It's become routine to have about a 3-month delay at least in the passing of these bills. But within the defense committees, I'm fortunate, I guess, to be able to work in an environment in which people on both sides of the aisle care a lot about national security and are reasonably knowledgeable about the threats and what we need to do about them. So I'm not terribly worried about our committees, at least on the fundamental content of the defense enterprise, funding the things that we need to do. But I am very worried in the political environment we have in general about getting bills passed this year.
Jay Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, says that the threat of cyber keeps him up at night. What keeps you up at night?
Well, cyber's certainly on the list. What I worry about most is time. I started my posture hearings for the Congress last year with a quote from MacArthur to the effect that military failure can almost always be summed up in 2 words: too late. I'm concerned about us being too late to make the changes that we need to make. And part of that, of course, is getting the funding and then getting on with the research and development we need to do and then fielding things. But it all starts with getting the funding.
And you've been in this field 50 years. Just last question on this is just, obviously the defense industry has changed so much, the threats have changed so much. But, for the next generation, what should we be doing? And obviously you just referred to it as not be reactionary, but to act first.
Yeah, my first 20 years of my career, you're reminding me how old I am, but the first 20 years of my career were in the Cold War. And I worried about the Soviet Union. And I worried about their attempts to defeat us, modernize their forces in a way that would be effective against us. So I know what it's like to have a peer competitor. And then we spent about 30 years with American dominance and dealing with counterinsurgency, counterterrorism. And now I think it's more generally recognized that we're back into a strategic competition. We're in a race for military technological superiority, and we have got to move quickly in that race. It's not an arms race where we're trying to build more battleships than the other guy. It's really more about applying technology as quickly and as effectively as possible to get more efficient ways to conduct military operations. And so that's what I'm about. And that's what keeps me up at night. The need to make the right decisions and move forward as quickly as possible.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Bob. Good to talk to you.
Thanks again to Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall. That brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to GE Aerospace for their support and to all of you for watching. For those who missed any of these conversations this afternoon, we will have video from the event on our website, thehill.com, shortly. I'm Bob Cusack. Have a great rest of your day.